Okay, today we're talking about the labor/factor markets. That's an important concept in microeconomics, and it could be a little confusing at first, but hopefully I'll help you out with that today. Primarily, firms are now consumers. Capital and labor are typically the products that you'll study being sold in the factor market and microeconomics. And particularly for labor, wage will be equal to price. Now, the factor market can include capital, labor, even land, but when you're in microeconomics, you will mostly study the labor market in particular. Capital, in particular, is supplied by firms. For example, machines that make fries are bought by consumers like Wendy's and McDonald's. Capital does not satisfy consumer wants. It helps in the production of goods and services that do satisfy consumer wants. Labor, on the other hand, is supplied through the population. That is to say, the literal number of qualified workers in a given market. As we can see here, this fact it influences the supply and it influences the demand for particular laborers. For instance, if there are more requirements for someone, like, for say, a doctor has to go through medical school and there are more requirements they have to fulfill in order to perform that occupation, then the supply curve will, generally speaking, it will be shifted more left. There will be less of them, and the demand will most likely be higher. Fast food workers, for instance, though, it's considered unskilled labor, and so there will be a greater supply of unskilled laborers in the fast food market, and so the supply will be greater, and generally speaking, this is why doctors are paid more than fast food workers. So we can see here that the quantity of doctors perhaps may be in the hundreds, whereas the quantity of fast food workers may be in the thousands. Now, for the factor market, demand can be affected by a few things. Number one, a change in productivity. If the laborers, in particular since we're studying labor and microeconomics, if the laborers are suddenly more productive, more will be demanded. If there's a change in technology, for instance, though, say there's capital that's introduced that can produce better than 5 laborers, for instance, then the demand for labor may decrease. If there's a change in the quantity of inputs, a change in the quantity of other resource inputs, or a change in the price of other resources, that can also affect the demand. Going off of what I just said, with the shifts in demand, change in the product price in the product market, for instance, if the good produced by the laborers in the labor market, if the price of that good increases, then the firm will want to employ more laborers to produce the product. A change in the productivity of workers will do the same thing, like I just said, or a change in the productivity of other factors of production, like capital, for instance. Shifts in supply. Now, for this, a graph will have to be drawn, and this deals primarily with the substitution effect and the income effect. Now, what we have on the vertical axis would be the wage. And what we have on the horizontal axis would be the hours of labor. Now, it's interesting, this is the only graph that I've ever studied in microeconomics that actually looks like a backwards C. Now, what happens below that point I just drew was that the substitution effect, which I'll explain here in a moment, is greater than the income effect. At this point right here, the substitution effect is equal to the income effect. And above, the substitution effect is less than the income effect. Now, what's happening down here is that the particular laborer is substituting leisure for work hours. So he wants to work more in order to make more money, but he is sacrificing leisure to do it. But at this point, they're equal, and above that point, as you can see as the graph represents, that the number of hours that the laborer is willing to work decreases as his income increases. And this is why the income effect is greater on top. Now, moving away from the markets and toward the firms, we have to understand two important keys here. First of all, what's marginal revenue product? It is the demand curve for a particular firm. It's the extra revenue per unit of input. And the equation for this is going to be a change in total revenue divided by a change in the quantity employed. Next would be the next would be the marginal resource cost, or MRC, and for individual firm, it is the supply curve. It's the extra cost of resources per unit of input. And the equation for that would be the change in total cost divided by the change in the quantity of resources employed. A particularly important concept when we're talking about the labor and the factor market is derived demand, which we touched on a little bit earlier, but it's important to really get this concept down. Basically, the derived demand is the demand for labor or capital, which is the result of the demand for other inputs, complements or substitutes, whatever they may be, or product market goods. So, for example, an increase in the demand for milk in the product market will increase the demand for cows in the labor market. This isn't particularly hard to understand. Or if we're talking about, say, complements, for instance, if the price of gas were to fall and truck drivers and gas are complements, then the demand for truck drivers would increase. All right, now we're talking about what the different factor markets. I mean, in the product market, you've studied perfectly competitive markets, and you've studied monopolies, you've studied oligopolies. Here we're going to talk about the perfectly competitive factor market. And basically, the market itself is similar to the product market for a perfectly competitive firm. The price would be the wage. Move the quantities down here. The demand curve is still downward sloping for the market. The supply curve is upward sloping. And wherever the equilibrium is, that is the wage that prevails in the market itself. Or as the wage that prevails in the market, and is also the wage that will be employed, the wage that will be set for any individual firm. And this becomes the, as we talked earlier, the marginal resource cost curve. And the MRP is the demand curve. As I put down here, as you can see, for a conceptual note, it's important to note this because each firm in perfect competition produces a homogeneous product at identical prices, the firm's MRC, or their supply curve, is perfectly elastic. This means that every piece of capital, every available labor in the given market is perfectly suitable for employment at any perfectly competitive firm in this market. So this makes the marginal resource cost totally responsive to changes in wages. So 5 laborers working at firm A can do the same job with the same output. They can do everything the same as 5 laborers in firm A. So 5 laborers in firm B can do whatever the laborers in firm A can. So perfectly substitutable. This is, generally this is dealing in theory, but it's important to note that this is why MRC is perfectly elastic. As you've studied in the product market for all markets, the same holds true in the factor market, that MRC equals MRP, and this is the profit maximizing quantity. It's similar to MR equals MC in the product market. In the factor market, it happens to be MRC equals MRP, and this is true for perfect competition. This is true for monopsonies, which I'll get to in a moment. It's true for imperfect competition. So that's just something important to note. All right, a monopsony is a single buyer in the market. Therefore, it is the market itself. It is a monopsony, basically. A monopoly in the product market becomes a monopsony in the labor market, more or less. And graphically, that'd be represented like this. You have the wage as the price, and you have quantity below. MRP is still downward sloping. Now there's a true supply curve, and then there's the monopsony's marginal resource cost curve. And this is upward sloping. It is not perfectly elastic. Now what will occur, obviously profit maximizing, as I said earlier, occurs where MRP equals MRC, so the quantity that will be employed will be at this quantity. However, the wage will be set where the profit maximizing quantity crosses the supply curve, the true supply curve of the market. And so this is the wage that will be paid. Again, this is consistent with monopsonies in the product market who typically supply less than a perfectly competitive firm would, or even less than a monopoly would. And again, just to reiterate, profit maximization of any factor market always occurs where MRP is equal to MRC. Now, sometimes to cut losses, they may not profit maximize. Sometimes they may employ the least cost rule, which is they're basically trying to find the combination of labor and capital in the smallest amount, but that will still allow the firm to stay alive. And the equation for this, as I show here, is where the marginal product of capital divided by the price of capital equals the marginal product of labor divided by the price of labor. Now, those have to equal each other. They don't have to both equal 1. They don't have to both equal any particular number. Just as long as they are equal, that is where they produce at the least cost. It's also important to note that, say, if you're doing, sometimes in micro you'll have to do a table to find. You'll be given a table and you have to find the least cost rule. Well, to find the least cost rule, again, you use a formula. However, they will always produce at the greatest quantity. So if these were to both equal at 1 and they both equaled at 3, then they would produce at 3. And always take the highest number. And that more or less is the factor market.